Today we're going to be talking about stakeholder attitudes to vernacular literacy implementation in Ambrym in Vanuatu. We're going to be talking about changes to the recent changes to the national education policy in Vanuatu over the last few years. We're looking at a case study from North Ambrym and Southeast Ambrym, which is also known as Vatlongos. We're looking at how this is being implemented in schools, how the teachers are feeling about its implementation, whether they're enjoying it or not, and looking at community attitudes towards the new implementation as well. So Vanuatu is one of the most linguistically dense places in the world, with over 130 local languages. It also has two colonizer languages, English and French, along with the national language, Bislama, which is spoken by 99% of the population. And it's also, Bislama is also sort of replacing some of the local and indigenous languages in some of different domains, and also in entire villages as well. Under the old education system in Vanuatu, in theory, only English and French could be taught, and students were often punished for using Bislama or their local languages in the school. But more recently, and in practice, Fiona Willens had found that teaching had often been supported with Bislama or the local languages in the classroom to aid understanding of different topics. Language choice in the school, either English or French, was often determined by religion, so either Catholic or Presbyterian, as the schools were run by missionaries before, and still some to this day. So all the Catholic schools are in French, or the Presbyterian or Anglican schools are English. Primary schools are day schools, so people go along for the day, generally more likely to be one language type of school, so in one sort of indigenous language area, whereas secondary schools are boarding schools, usually residential then, and people who go to them have mixed language backgrounds. There aren't as many high schools. For instance, there's no high schools in Southeast Ambrym, but there are 2 in North Ambrym, so people come from different islands and different language communities to go to high school. There were obviously lots of problems with the old system. There's some very low literacy and other academic outcomes. So only around 30% of children could achieve reading fluency by year 3, and overall 30% literacy in rural areas. So yeah, pretty bad outcomes all around. Teachers themselves, they often struggle with oral English, French, and especially when they're teaching at primary level. Often teachers have come straight from high school without any teacher training and are taken to teach in the lower classes in primary school. So their comprehension of English or French is very low. And also teaching of English and French is quite damaging to the maintenance of local languages at a general level, which are also protected in the Constitution.
Okay, and from 2012, there's been a new national language policy, which has encouraged the use of vernacular to mean local languages and or Bislama in the first 3 years of primary school, followed by a gradual transition to the languages of education, i.e. English and French. There is explicit guidance to support learning of English or French with Bislama and local languages, rather than under the previous system where that was often punished or frowned upon. And there is support for the production of parallel materials in Bislama and the most spoken local languages, which was interpreted as being languages with more than 1,000 speakers. This involved the creation of readers, posters, and primers. And these were created in translation workshops with teachers that were facilitated by linguists and translators, some of whom are here today, for each language, and organised by VESP, especially Robert Early and Helen Tam-Tam, who are at USP. There were lots of challenges in implementing this new policy. Firstly, just producing those translations in the time frame available was a huge task, especially because many of the local languages involved do not have established orthographies and are under-described linguistically, so creating an orthography isn't a simple matter. There are lots of choices to face, such as which dialect and which orthographic system to use, where there are multiple ones to choose from. Within a classroom, the language backgrounds of students can be mixed, especially in urban areas, and teachers as well might not be familiar with literacy practices in their own local language, or sometimes teachers are from different language backgrounds than their classes, or are semi-speakers of their own language. This policy has been received, has had a mixed reception, let's say. So in the trials of the original policy, it was well received by teachers and parents directly involved. That seemed to be successful. But we've been keeping an eye on how this topic is discussed in Yumi Talk Talk Straight, a Facebook group which discusses kind of political and national issues in Vanuatu. And some of the recurrent themes that have come out of discussions of this are fears that students will not catch up with their English and French as they start to transfer. There's generally a lack of awareness of the evidence about better educational outcomes in children's vernacular. And there's especially negative attitudes to the use of Bislama in years 1 to 3, because Bislama is seen as a kind of lower language, as a pidgin or creole. And there are also fears that the policy is based on the opinions of foreign experts and that children are being used as guinea pigs in this. That was something that came up a lot in the forums. Now we're going to look at North Ambrym and Vatlongos communities, which are both on Ambrym. Here is Ambrym. The bit at the north is North Ambrym. Vatlongos is spoken in the southeast bit, off to the side there. And in the middle is a volcano.
Okay, so here are some of the villages where the language of North Ambrym is spoken. But just to note that there's also the geographic area of northern Ambrym, which has 2 languages. So North Ambrym, the main language, with about 5,000 speakers. And there's also a smaller language, with about 100 or so speakers, based in Faramsu village, just here. And with a couple of speakers in Ranvetlam next to it, and a couple of speakers in Konkon over on the other side. But all these speakers of this small language are bilingual in the larger North Ambrym language as well. There are 2 high schools. One is French and one is English medium, and 9 primary schools, 3 of those being French. The 3 primary schools, the French primary schools, are mission schools. They're run by the Catholics. And 6 English schools. I think some are mixed between government-run schools and some are Presbyterian-run schools. The main religions are Presbyterian and Catholic, but lots of different denominations are coming in. Neil Thomas Ministry, I think, has their own school as well now. Or it's the Trinasapa school. Language support previous to the new implementation of the national language policy. Myself, I'd undertaken some teacher training workshops in 2013 and 2014, and together with the community we produced 40 different literacy books and a trilingual dictionary that published like 12,000 books, and we distributed those to the different teachers. So they had quite a lot of training in how to use that and how to create different materials themselves as well. There's also Bible translation underway, and the Bible translators are doing child and adult literacy support in one of the villages, but they're also doing more teacher training throughout the primary schools as well. Yeah, here's just where the schools are. So we've got the 3 French schools. Mainly the French area is sort of the middle and to the northeast, but they also have a French school in Fanla as well. The rest of the schools are English medium schools. Okay.
These are the villages where Vatlongos is spoken. It's all the villages in southeast Ambrym here. I'd just like to point out that there's a slightly different dialect in Endu, the northernmost village, which you can see is quite removed from the others. Has a slightly different dialect of Vatlongos, and also lots of intermarriage with North Ambrym and lots of speakers of North Ambrym in that village, so a slightly different context there. The Vatlongos region is overwhelmingly Presbyterian Anglophone, with just 1 Catholic and Francophone village. A Catholic school was set up there in 1961. There has been some support for written language in Vatlongos. There was a 1970 dictionary by linguist Gary J. Parker, which hasn't been used that much by the community, but is a very useful resource. A Bible translation was completed in 2015, and many speakers were involved in the translation process, which included producing Sunday school and kindergarten materials in Vatlongos. The Presbyterian community, and therefore the Anglophone community, were quite dominant in that translation process. And the international translators were based in Palma, a nearby island, because they also produced the Parmese language translation. During my PhD project, we also produced some ebooks that were distributed on mobile phones from texts recorded for the documentation project. And I just want to point out that those are kind of edited, transcribed speech rather than written text. So although people were very interested in them and found them useful, they're not quite as engaging as a sort of well-designed, illustrated book might be. Here are the 5 primary schools in Vatlongos. One of the schools, the school in Ule, goes up to year 8, so the first 2 years of secondary, and Pamal is where the only French school is. Next, we're going to talk about implementation in schools. This is based on some interviews that Mike has done in the last couple of months, and also our wider knowledge of what's been happening there.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so in Northumbrium, I conducted interviews with two teachers from Rannon Primary School, which is near to the village I stay. I talked to a Class 1 teacher and a Class 5 teacher, the deputy headmaster. All three teachers for the first 3 years of primary school are Northumbrium speakers, though Class 1 teacher is actually from neighbouring island Pentecost, but is a fluent speaker of Northumbrium. They're all teaching the vernacular language in years 1 to 3 through the materials that we produced together, and also from the Ministry of Education. But the Ministry of Education materials that have arrived, only the Class 2 and Class 3 materials have arrived. The Class 1 materials, which, I can't remember what year we did.
That was
2015, have not arrived. The books have arrived, but because they're in Bislama, and then they have some vernacular language stickers, which were meant to be stuck onto them, the stickers have not arrived. Apparently, they're in Malakula on another island. A boat was dispatched with the zone curriculum advisor to go and find them, but he came back empty-handed. Yeah, so there's problems with that. But the Class 1 teacher was one of the teachers who participated in the translation workshops, and she's absolutely fantastic. And so she's retranslated all the materials herself onto paper and in large typeface so that the students can all read together. But it's far from ideal, basically. They have had phonics training from myself and from the Ministry of Education. Ministry of Education teaches them how to use phonics for English or French or for Bislama, but they're quite happy to adapt this to the local languages. They do think that they need more materials, so each week they have a particular topic that they need to discuss and teach in class, but there aren't enough literacy materials for each of those topics to be taught, so they need things to match those topics. They're actually quite happy that the new students who are actually entering Class 1 and Class 2, they already know how to read in the language. They already know the alphabet because they're being taught that in the kindergarten. So there is support at the kindergarten level. But again, the kindergarten level, they create their own materials themselves. They highlighted that the Class 3 teacher hasn't had much training in using of the literacy materials, and they think that more training could be needed there. And finally, the 3 French schools have reverted back to using French only because they're privately run schools run by the Catholics. They can do that, and they're not government-run schools. So, yeah, shame on them, I say.
Okay, so we also have a same detailed case study of one primary school in the southeast. This school has 6 teachers, 4 of whom speak Vatlongos and 2 speak Parmese, the language of the neighbouring island. Vatlongos materials are being used in years 1 and 3, but because the year 2 teacher speaks Parmese, they switch to Bislama for year 2 and then switch back to Vatlongos in year 3. They only started using the materials in 2019, so this academic year, even though the materials they did arrive, which is great, but they arrived in 2015 and took a while to be used. The situation with the stickers was unfortunate. Teachers had training in the Bislama curriculum, but haven't had any specific support for using the Vatlongos materials, so that's a serious problem. And the headmaster, who Mike interviewed, identified training needs in using the orthographic system, but also in creative use of the materials, because it's quite a different teaching style that you need when you are using the children's first language compared to if you're trying to introduce them to a completely new language in the first few years of school. And he also pointed out that because teachers often change the years that they're teaching, all of the teachers need this training. It can't just be restricted to those who are down to teach years 1 to 3 immediately. Just some information about the other schools in Vatlongos that I picked up between 2015 and 2018, so it's out of date but gives you a sense of some of the intentions. Two of the other schools were planning to use Vatlongos materials but hadn't started using the year 1 materials in 2017. The Francophone school was planning to use Vatlongos materials but also to keep using French, thank you. But I'm not quite sure what that was intended to look like or how that might be playing out. the school in Endu, that northernmost village that has a slightly different dialect, was most likely to use Bislama materials because many children speak North Ambrym rather than Vatlongos at home. Many children are not confident in using Vatlongos, and some members of the community felt there was a need for materials in Endu Vatlongos. They didn't want to use materials in the main variety of Vatlongos. Okay, now we're going to talk about sort of attitudes in the community towards the new policy. This is based on an attitude survey also conducted by Mike in the last few weeks. He's been working very hard, which has involved 20 speakers from each of the 2 language communities who are a mix of ages and genders. It was conducted in Bislama and had 16 Likert-style questions. So, for example, they were given a statement like "Mi fraise language by lose." I'm afraid that my language is going to be lost. And were asked whether they agree a bit, don't agree, or don't agree at all. And this was very recent. The sample opinions were based on responses to open questions in a language attitude survey with Vatlongos speakers that was part of my PhD project. And we picked out these themes to focus on. So it was opinions targeting issues around language maintenance, linguistic purism, so the idea that you don't want the language to be contaminated, educational outcomes, access to the Bible, it's an entirely Christian area, the status of written language, and attitudes to Bislama. So, as this was done very recently, we have not yet conducted any sort of, very detailed analysis. We've just identified the overarching trends here. But things that both communities had in common were a fear of language loss. The majority of speakers interviewed in both agreed that they feared the language being lost. See custom practices and linguistic purity as reasons to maintain the language. Believe that education in the vernacular language will improve English language skills. Interestingly, there was a slight difference in French, which we'll come to. And both communities were quite split on whether or not it's important for children to learn Bislama and whether or not Bislama is cool or good. For language maintenance, the differences were that more North Ambrym speakers believe that language should be maintained because it contains a lot of knowledge. And this kind of matches with our experience of, in North Ambrym, custom practices are more highly valued than in Southeast Ambrym, which has been maybe more, the Presbyterian Church has been very strong in Southeast Ambrym, and there's a lot of fear around custom practices, where that's less the case in North Ambrym, perhaps. And more Vatlongos speakers believe that teaching in schools is a good way to maintain the language. There seems to be more kind of faith in the school system as a way of doing that in Southeast Ambrym than North Ambrym. Around educational outcomes, more North Ambrym speakers believed that using the vernacular in school would make information clearer. But more Vatlongos speakers believe that using the language makes the meaning of the Bible clearer. And I think that's maybe because they've just completed this big Bible translation project. It's very high in people's minds. Interestingly, also more speakers in Vatlongos believe that education in language improved French skills. They believe that to the same extent that they believe that about English. Whereas for the North Ambrym speakers, nearly all of them agreed that it would improve English, but not as many believed that it would improve French. And that maybe matches with the decisions that the French language schools have made to stop, to not try to teach vernacular for the first 3 years. In terms of attitudes to Bislama, more North Ambrym speakers believe that Bislama gives access to knowledge in books. There seemed to be a general prioritization of knowledge in North Ambrym, which was interesting. But more were afraid that children were shifting to Bislama. Whereas more Vatlongos speakers believe that children mostly speak Bislama, not language, but they weren't particularly afraid of that. It was sort of accepted as the status quo. Okay, so that's the overall what's happened in the different languages. And overall, the attitudes towards vernacular education seem to be quite positive. I will let Mike draw some conclusions.
Okay, so despite criticism of the role of Bislama in online forums, the actual attitudes to local vernacular language in education in rural areas such as Ambrym is actually quite positive. But we do think that the next sort of obstacle that needs to be surmounted is teacher confidence in order to implement the policy favourably, especially in how they use the vernacular writing system, but also because teaching in vernacular is a different style, completely different style to teaching in English or to teaching in French. We also think that in the people who've worked on the translation of the materials from Bislama into local language are highly placed to be at the forefront of training other teachers in using the materials. They've had the most amounts of training than any other teacher has in using the vernacular literacy materials, and we think these should be put forward and highlighted. And really, at the moment, I think they're just left to teach in the schools, and no one else is doing any sort of training in vernacular literacy education. This really needs to be highlighted, I think, and these teachers need to be put to the forefront. And yeah, and if you think, yeah, especially there needs to be more encouragement, especially for the francophone teachers who could feel perhaps less included or invested in the new system. Well, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. There is any question?
Hello.
Hi. Thank you very much. What proportion of primary school teachers would you say are actually trained in your areas? Like have had teachers' college training?
Oh, I don't know, but you do meet quite a lot who have come straight from high school and are teaching without any formal education. Normally that's sort of the start, and if they continue then they'll go on to collect teacher training in Port Vila and then come back and teach. But you know, sometimes they drop out after a couple of years and someone else comes and replaces them.
Sorry.
Sorry, yeah, just similarly, I wouldn't want to say exactly, but I'd say more than half of the teachers who I've interacted with have had some training at some point, but there are young people who are kind of drafted in at the last minute when they realise that there aren't enough teachers to teach a particular year, and they're kind of left to go it alone, really.
Yeah. I'm more familiar with kindy, model kindy. Do you have model kindy? And so these are the kindergartens that are actually teaching alphabets and literacy, which they're not supposed to do, are they?
We do have model kindies in the southeast, definitely. They've been pretty successful.
But the philosophy of model kindy is not giving kids reading and writing skills, which the parents don't like because they want them to learn to read and write. Yeah.
No, there is quite a lot of emphasis on that. And the materials that were produced by the Bible translators in the Vatlongos area are extremely literacy focused, like very, very beyond what I would expect at that level. But I don't think everyone's using those equally is the impression I've got.
Yeah, and in North Ambrym there's, I think, 9 kindergartens that I've counted a couple of years ago, and the literacy materials that we worked on together were distributed to them as well. They use the primers and they read the sort of stories to the children. So they are learning the alphabet, but I think that's as far as it really goes, and to recognise letters. But I don't think they're actually actively teaching literacy too much. So it's more like learning of words and being used to visualising letters and so on. But yeah, I'm not sure. I haven't done too much work with the kindergartens. So.
I'll try and talk to you guys later.
Thank you.
Nick?
No. Sorry.
Lost your chance.
Thanks for your talk. So one question which you didn't mention, maybe because it's not a problem in your area or it's not a problem anymore, I don't know, is the origin, the geographical and then hence linguistic origin of the teacher. So the pattern I tended to see was for kindy, for very young schools, schools for young children, the teacher was from the village and thus was a speaker of the language. But for, I guess, higher levels or schools for age, 8 or 9 year old children, they would come from the other end of Vanuatu on a nation-based system, so they would not even speak the language. So Bislama was the natural, albeit not officially allowed language between them. They would use Bislama, and they would actually not know the language. Is that a problem that you're facing, or that you've seen?
So that's been a problem at the primary school in Southeast Ambrym that I was talking about, where the year 2 teacher is a speaker of Parmese who doesn't speak Batlongos, and that's why they're using Bislama in that year. But there doesn't seem to be, that I haven't come across many teachers from other areas. That might be because Ambrym has such a bad reputation that teachers refuse to come to Ambrym.
They fear the magic.
Yeah, no, that's a fear that people have talked about that a lot in the educational setting, that they can't get teachers to come and teach, especially in North Ambrym, because everybody's afraid of the black magic that's practiced there. So, yeah.
So when I
It's normally
introduced
local
some
teachers.
literacy materials that I had made, so there were 2 schools on Motalava Island, and in one school it was welcomed, with open arms, and the teacher was from Motlap, and he could speak, he could immediately start, working on that. The other school had a teacher from Ambai, and he was just puzzled, and saying, I'm sorry, I'm here for another 2 or 3 years, we won't be able to use your materials. So it's, I could see.
I think it is really interesting how that may or may not end up affecting how the ministry organises teachers' postings.
Yep.
Yeah, I think that's going to be really interesting to see.
Yeah, Daniel.
Daniel?
Sorry.
Yeah,
Okay.
Daniel, and then yeah,
Sure.
Mary.
Okay. Do your languages have some special letters or like diacritics? Because I've heard that in the village that they struggle using the language on the phone or the computer in school because you've got these macrons and stuff. Does that happen?
For North Ambrym, we tried to keep it as simple as possible, so we use digraphs for any sort of labia velars, so the bois would be BW,
Okay.
palatalized consonants,
So the
BY.
orthography is easy enough.
Yeah, I mean, there
Yeah.
is some vowels with diacritics, but those are ones that are found on phones nowadays anyway. Yeah, and in reading those, people don't seem to have a problem reading them. So
Okay.
I think also whether people are exposed to English or French as a language of education can affect their attitudes to diacritics as well.
Thanks. This is really nice and quite timely. I mean, because I know that the ministry's been doing quite a lot of work trying to evaluate the results of introducing the vernacular reading programs, and they've got some pretty stark results, which I can actually show you in the break if you want. I mean, basically the short answer is if you get taught in your local language at the end of year 4 or year 6, your literacy skills in either English or French will be off the charts. If you get started in French or English, you are very likely to fail. But yeah, I guess my larger question was, how do you connect what you guys are doing? I think it's fantastic that you're asking people in the community in particular what they think of all of this, because there's been a lot of discussion amongst linguists and teachers. So how do you imagine, are you envisaging bringing together what you guys are doing with what people like the Ministry of Education are doing to evaluate the programs? I mean, how are you going to be communicating this, and who are you going to be communicating it to?
that's a good question.
We'd really like advice on that. That is something that we've been thinking about and trying to work out what is the best way to do that. And a venue like this, where I know lots of people have been involved in that, was something that we wanted to get feedback on. Yeah, and also I just think it's something that, like, Mike worked this into his existing project or ask these questions. I think it's something that all of us could be doing while we're there to try and get as wide a view on this as possible. That would be really great.
Sorry, I'm French, so I don't understand a lot, but I understand little. Does an education, does it exist only system of education in Vanuatu? Because I mean, in the presentation you present, different types of school where there is different languages, but it can be an issue if teachers are formed to be teachers. They have to adapt their abilities to a specific school, you know?
Yeah, definitely. And that's part of what this policy was aimed at, because before this, the French and English school systems were completely separate. So people who were trained in French learnt the French system, had a French curriculum, had training in the French system, and it was completely separate from the English system. This system is supposed to be able to be delivered in either English or French or Bislama, and all the vernacular languages. And the curriculum is written in Bislama, which most people understand.